Hey there guys, Godly Seafood here. Today we're going to be looking into a world rather than any one specific character throughout the spiral. To start off with, I thought I'd talk about my overall favorite world in the game, Dragonspyre. So before I get into it, talking about Dragonspyre's history, I think it needs to be pointed out that most of Kingsisle's history throughout the spiral seems to resemble very big ideas that can tell you a somewhat comprehensible story. But when you start digging down into it, if I ever start talking about, somebody doing something and not knowing how they did it or why they did it or this or that, or I start talking about theory and speculation based off of knowledge that I know and can point to in a dialogue script or in some lore point, just know that it's because there probably isn't an answer for it, and you'll find out what I'm talking about later on. Dragonspyre is a world with very rich history and lore, whose own history reminds me a lot about Rome, or rather, the civilization of Rome, where it was originally ruled by a monarch, and later in history that monarch would work alongside a senatorial body which would look to strengthen the voice of the people. You can see some of this reflected in some of the lore books scattered throughout the world of Dragonspyre. In the original Wizard101 storyline, there were 7 different history books scattered throughout the world of Dragonspyre, telling about the history of Dragonspyre from its very earliest days up until the more recent events, yet not including all of the history and lore around the summoning of the Dragon Titan and anything happening after that. So, getting into the history of Dragonspyre, I feel I need to talk about the first world. The first world was shattered by the constant fighting of the Storm Titan, the Ice Titan, and the Fire Titan, also known as the Dragon Titan. Well, apparently, after it was destroyed and then woven back together into the spiral, Dragonspyre seems to be where some men and a lot of the drakes and dragons ended up. It's stated that Dragonspyre was a haven, probably meaning that it was a lush and vibrant land, full of, opportunity and life. However, it's also stated that men lived in constant fear of the dragons, and this got so bad to the point where, at some point, the King of Men met with the Queen of the Drakes in secret in order to combine forces and wipe out the dragons. It is pretty crazy stuff. Well, this would inevitably usher in an age of peace, followed by an age of non-peace. Apparently that peace was broken when a king died on the throne without actually leaving an heir, which led to a bunch of political instability and a succession crisis. That was called the Centuries War because it was important, I guess. They don't really go too far into detail as to why it was super important. It's kind of like a filler line of text. It just sets up what's coming next, but it's not super important. What came next was this era of peace and prosperity, where the inhabitants of Dragonspyre and the kingdom of Dragonspyre started coming together and, forming their society a little bit more. But one interesting thing that came out of it was a whole bunch of, mages throughout Dragonspyre came together and created this thing called a knowledge crystal. With the invention of the knowledge crystal came new and more innovative ways to actually record and store knowledge. A knowledge crystal is basically a magical construct, i.e. a crystal, that you can impart knowledge to or store knowledge in. Hence the name.
Knowledge
Crystal. It's very simple. However, the knowledge crystal can be used in a multitude of different ways. You can do simple things as write down lesson plans, like how to train your dragon and the basic needs of Drake Care and Drake Writing 101. However, you can also imbue your own personal spirit or soul into this knowledge crystal without killing yourself, mind you. There are multiple different examples of this, pretty famous one being when Malistaire tried to revive his wife Sylvia and turned her into a wraith, locked her up in Sylvia's tomb, and then we, the player, come along and basically defeat her spirit, but also trap her spirit in a knowledge crystal. A completely different scenario would be when Squire Gregor actually records his own personal thoughts and experiences on a knowledge crystal. He seems to have imbued his spirit into that, and we can see the difference between young Gregor and older Squire Gregor after he's been through obviously many different battles and he's all cut up, his hair's long. Like, there is a visible difference between young Gregor and old Gregor, and apparently, I don't know that this is stated in fact, however, I would imagine that both versions of Gregor are either knowledge crystals, or one is a knowledge crystal and one is his actual soul. I'm pretty sure they're both knowledge crystals, so they're both recordings of his spirit. So he recorded his spirit twice. It's interesting, but I'll get into that later. And the third and final way we've seen a knowledge crystal be used is to literally warp through time. Seriously, in the original vanilla storyline of Wizard101, our character meets an undead Dragonspyre soul whose life mission it was to study knowledge crystals, and he inevitably found a knowledge crystal that could actually grow different facets and allow him to see through parts of time. Well, he would inevitably create a machine that would allow him to utilize that crystal, which caused our character to go back in time and reshape certain events to play out in a way that would allow us to move the plot line along, and it's a whole thing. Just know that knowledge crystals are very powerful things, and they can do a whole bunch of things other than write down your grocery list. So moving forward throughout history, Dragonspyre would inevitably take a pretty interesting approach to the subject of knowledge, where it was basically decided that knowledge would be reserved for royalty and the likes of kings rather than the common peasantry. And for anybody who's smart enough to understand where this goes, it had the very obvious side effect of leaving the population not smart and incapable whenever disaster struck. And that's exactly what happened. At some point, some guy named Rydal the Conqueror inadvertently unleashed a magical plague that completely and utterly leads to one of the greatest dungeon storylines ever, called the Catacombs. If you haven't played it, if you haven't listened through it, I would highly recommend it. But Kingsisle took the entirety of the storyline from the Catacombs, basically from this one line in the book, but I'll get into that in a second. Apparently, Rydal's plague was such a big deal, and it was just completely decimating the entirety of the Dragonspyre population, which caused an uprising, like a social uprising, which threatened the ruling monarch of Dragonspyre to the point where one of the princes left. This was such a big deal that some dude named Duke Sebastian basically confronted the lords of Dragonspyre for knowledge of the cure, and from that point on, the entire outlook of knowledge completely changed for Dragonspyre. Dragonspyre decided that from that day forward, they would found a school called Dragonspyre Academy, which would allow its population to grow knowledgeful, as well as they would inevitably cause it to be the sort of institution that also indoctrinated or helped integrate people from the Dragonspyre population into their armies or into their fighting force, or whatever you want to call it, which is pretty interesting. You know, Dragonspyre started taking on this form of a civilization that had a warrior type culture, I guess you could say. Moving forward from that, a bunch of things actually start to take shape from the inevitable lack of leadership left behind the wake of Rydal's plague and other events that happened at that same exact time. Apparently, this one dude ended up unseating the king, and he was just a total douchebag. Like, nobody liked him. His rule was stated to be without mercy, and it took the combined efforts of all of the wizards and warriors of Dragonspyre to unite against him, and they basically, probably killed him, throw him out of power. And from that point on, Dragonspyre would inevitably be ruled by a joint council of wizards, warriors, and then the king. Well, this is actually where you can start to see more things taking shape from the events of the Catacombs and Rydal's plague. In later years, the power of the king would inevitably waver due to, the prince probably running off and leaving everybody for dead. And wizards and warriors would inevitably start to have a bit of a power struggle in, politics. At some point, a bunch of warriors thought it would be a real funny idea to try and take control of all the spells used by the wizards throughout the kingdom, and this absolute fucking mad lad wizard decides to fight a warrior in open single combat and actually wins. This is pretty interesting because it sets up the idea that wizards were probably seen as weaker than warriors in solo combat, and from here we can make a bunch of inferences about what actually happens between now and the summoning of the Dragon Titan later on. So before I get too ahead of myself and start talking about the events that happen later on after the founding of Dragonspyre and the Council of Wizards, Warriors, and Kings being formed, I feel that it's super important that I take a step back and talk about some of the events that happened in the immediate aftermath of Rydal's plague. Like I had mentioned earlier, this guy named Rydal came along and inadvertently unleashed a plague upon Dragonspyre, which, from what we can tell, basically decimated the population of Dragonspyre. You know, all the people just dying left and right. And a huge factor of this happened to be the fact that knowledge was being solely reserved for the rights of king and nobility. This fact, as well as the fact that everybody was dying around them and nobody had the means to find a cure, would inevitably cause a social uprising that basically shook the foundation of Dragonspyre and its ruling party of government to its very core. So much so that the Prince of Dragonspyre at the time, Prince Vigor, decided to take a ton of soldiers and basically just dip. He left. He took as many soldiers as he could get, and they decided to brave the skyways. Like, the skyways are apparently filled with a ton of like flying monsters and pirates and, you know, stormy bad weather. Like, think the open seas. Like, they were basically fleeing in the most dangerous route possible, and yet, given the circumstances, Prince Vigor seemed to think that that was his best bet to escape the tragedies of Dragonspyre. Well, after Prince Vigor braved the skyways, leaving his homeworld like a little bitch, he ended up in the Ravenwoods, and there's actually a reason for this. Apparently, way back in prehistoric, like ancient times of Dragonspyre, a group of tree minders met with the nobility of Dragonspyre and ended up basically giving them spell tree saplings, which would inevitably grow into spell trees, which is where Dragonspyre actually got their spell trees from, like Ashley and that one dead tree. I don't know what his shtick is, even though he's there. You know, all those trees came from the tree minders who lived in the Raven Woods, who tended to the great tree Bartleby. And a lot of things end up happening once Prince Vigor gets to the Ravenwoods. When Prince Vigor touched down on Ravenwood soil, he decided that he was going to take his army and basically march up to the nearest tree minder settlement or encampment or however they lived, and straight up, completely and arrogantly demanding that he be granted an audience with the great tree Bartleby, and that all of the powers, all of the spells that the tree minders had would be his and no one else's, and that all of the tree minders would be subject to him, and that they would be essentially subservient to him because he was nobility. Well, as anyone could guess, this didn't quite go over too well. It's actually pretty funny. The tree minders basically just kind of sit there and say nothing, either to fuck with him or just purely out of spite. Either way, this kind of flared up tensions on Vigor's side, because he's thinking that he's this nobility, he's got this army behind him. How can a bunch of, you know, savage trees and tree minders disobey him, right? That's his line of thinking. Well, he didn't account on them being particularly skilled with magic and fully capable of kicking their asses. Seriously, it was a fucking bloodbath. The war basically ends in Vigor's defeat. So originally, when declaring war against the tree minders, Prince Vigor had actually completely underestimated the tree minder forces and had gone so far as to promise his men that there would be a very swift end to the fighting. I guess, for some reason, Prince Vigor thought that the inhabitants of the world where magic comes from, as far as the Dragonspyrians knew it as, the Ravenwoods, he thought that the stewards of that world would be completely and utterly defenseless or willing to just give up all of their rights and serve him and just wouldn't be a threat. He could not have been more wrong. The tree minders absolutely mopped the fucking floor with the Dragonspyre army. So much so that not a single fucking survivor survived. There was nobody on the Dragonspyre side left at the end of the war as far as we know it. One thing I forgot to mention is the fact that even though the tree minders completely wiped the fucking floor with Vigor's forces, it wasn't like a perfect match or anything. Both sides lost very heavily, and both sides were basically decimated after the fighting. The point I was trying to convey is just the fact that the tree minders absolutely were giving the Dragonspyrians a run for their money. So one of the characters I wanted to talk about is Squire Gregor and Sir Gregor. So for anybody who doesn't know, Squire Gregor and Sir Gregor are the exact same person, except their souls were recorded into knowledge crystals at different times. Apparently at the very beginning of the war, as well as the beginning of, Rydal's Plague, Vigor taking his army to retreat to the Ravenwoods, Squire Gregor was a young dude. He was full of life. Visibly, he had, his face was shaved clean, his hair was nice and combed. He was the epitome of a greenie, a newbie. He was young and positive, and that's not a bad thing. Eventually, however, Squire Gregor would weather out the entire war, constantly fighting, constantly going through battle after battle, and this would have a lasting effect on his physical appearance, his mental and emotional state, and just his overall ideological change about the war itself. The now Sir Gregor would be visibly, physically older, his hair grown out long, his face barely shaved properly, his demeanor and attitude, his emotional and mental state just completely and utterly negative. To give you an idea of his thought process, one of his lines, one of his cheats in the Gregor fight is the phrase, "All things wither, all things die." And he seems to have completely taken a 360 on his philosophy of the war, believing it to have been a futile effort, which inevitably just led everybody to their deaths. And apparently he was actually one of the longest living survivors and happened to be one of the last people alive to be able to remember and record all of this. So, yeah. So throughout the war between Prince Vigor and his forces versus the Tree Minders and whatever forces they commanded, apparently in the catacombs there are 3 little side quests that can be kind of chronologically placed in those events that personally I think that are pretty noteworthy. The first one seems to be this quest given by a guy named Rogar Webfist, which seems to be him on campaign in another world. I'm not sure if it's Ravenwood or some other world, it never specifies. However, apparently Rogar ended up taking a spider from a world and bringing it to Dragonspyre. And he goes on to talk about how everybody says that it's a bad idea to introduce spiders into Dragonspyre, but he does it, and his whole shtick is he's stuck in a loop trying to remember, his spider and whatnot. And most of the quest is lame, but that part in the Dragonspyre lore is pretty interesting, and I'll talk about that later, because it has some pretty interesting implications and, stuff that we can see in present-day Dragonspyre. However, moving forward from that, probably a little bit early on in the war as well, would be the fact that a tree minder actually sold some of the spells that he knew, or some of the Ravenwood spells and magics, for a couple of baubles and trinkets. And lastly, this next side quest seems to be one that could be chronologically placed towards the end of the war when the Dragonspyrian soldiers seem to be growing desperate. This guy named Silas Forktongue, or Silas Forktongue, however you want to pronounce it, apparently got super upset with the way the war was going. He completely started to lose faith in Prince Vigor entirely, rightfully so, and this led him to devise a plan where he would actually create some sort of magical super weapon to burn the entire forest to the ground. Now you're probably asking, why didn't the Dragonspyrian army do this to begin with? And the reason was that Prince Vigor wanted to settle in these lands, so he didn't want to completely destroy it. But also he wanted the tree minders to be subservient, and he also wanted the spell trees to still be there so that he could take their power and, become a little bit more powerful with their magics as well. Destroying the forest would have been a complete no-go. That would have been the worst possible outcome for the Dragonspyrians, aside from being wiped off the face of the planet, which, kind of what happened. But anyway, this guy, Silas Forktongue, basically had it with Vigor, and he was going to completely and utterly burn the Ravenwoods down out of spite from losing all of his friends, his fellow comrades, and whatnot. And the quest is pretty interesting. Apparently, the events never quite came to pass. The tree minders actually ended up finding his device that was going to be powered by Dragonfire's breath or something. It's pretty interesting. I'd recommend going to go check it out if you aside from just reading the dialogue. It's pretty cool. So one of the characters I want to talk about in particular would be Prince Vigor. Arguably the star of the Catacombs dungeon quest line, Prince Vigor was a person of noble birth from the world of Dragonspyre. In fact, he was the prince of Dragonspyre, so he would have been next in line to the throne at some point in his life. He would have become king eventually. And due to his noble birth, he would have grown up around the elite and the nobility of Dragonspyre, so his perception and mentality and philosophies would have been shaped by that particular group of people. Well, it was pretty common in the early days of Dragonspyre to believe that knowledge should be reserved for the rights of king and nobility, so that the peasantry couldn't go around and fuck shit up, but also that they would be protected by their kingdom and nobility. Well, anyway, it turns out that some random dude came along and unleashed a plague, and because of that, the people of Dragonspyre felt that they needed knowledge to combat the plague, but also probably would have wanted a little bit of power to go along with that. The whole if you give a moose a muffin type story. You give the peasants a little bit of knowledge, they're going to want a little bit of power to go with it, and eventually, that would have led to probably a bit of a disaster for the Dragonspyre nobility. Well, because the Dragonspyre nobility was basically keeping knowledge and power and information from the Dragonspyre people due to their own, personal philosophies, this caused a social upheaval, which caused Prince Vigor to kind of take a look at things and say, you know what, Dragonspyre is basically a bit of a lost cause. I might want to go and create Dragonspyre anew somewhere else, and that's exactly what he did. Interestingly enough, the events of Rydal's plague and the subsequent social upheaval in Dragonspyre seem to have caused Prince Vigor to basically justify his own personal mentality and philosophies around the idea of knowledge. And this can be seen every time Prince Vigor learns of something happening because of people who aren't royalty having knowledge or having access to knowledge and power. Whenever he finds out that the Dragon Titan was summoned by a group of dark mages for political stuff, probably, he looks at that and says, see, I told you guys that knowledge and power shouldn't be given to just anyone because stuff like this can happen. And I've already seen it before with Rydal's plague. Or another example is when Prince Vigor finds out that the Alchemy Club basically, without supervision, created an alchemical potion that they then just haphazardly disposed of by dumping it down the drains, causing it to leak onto a knowledge crystal and cause the knowledge crystals to go haywire and frizz out and cause all the events of the Catacombs dungeons. Every time something like that happens, Prince Vigor looks at that and says, I told you this would happen because I've already seen it before with Rydal's plague. Surprisingly, even at the end, Prince Vigor sticks to this idea. The last will and testament of Prince Vigor that we take to be buried in Dragonspyre basically has his last thoughts stating that the war that he indulged in isn't as assured as he once thought, and he knows that Dragonspyre is changing. He knows that his people seek the power they feel is being kept from them, and he knows which way the wind is blowing. However, he also can't let go of this ideology that only the elite and royalty can be trusted with the knowledge, and he seems to think that history will prove him right. Ashley the Fire Tree actually butts in at the end of this and says, hey, I actually knew Prince Vigor, and history did not prove him right. She starts to talk about the change that Vigor was talking about, and this would be the foundation for Dragonspyre Academy. An academy where people of any social status could learn how to better use knowledge and magic alike. So after the founding of Dragonspyre Academy and the foundation of the Council of Wizards, Warriors, and King, it's not directly stated, but it's very heavily implied that there was a lot of political back and forth going on between the Wizards and Warriors of Dragonspyre. Apparently, it got so bad that the Warriors of Dragonspyre believed themselves to be in a pretty good political place to attempt a coup of sorts, where they basically decided they would take control of all of the magic in Dragonspyre, which typically had been under the authority of the Wizards in Dragonspyre. It was a pretty bold move. However, they didn't count on there being this absolute fucking mad lad of a wizard, Rurik Flamesoul, being capable of besting one of their greatest warriors in single, unarmed, solo combat. Like, apparently wizards were not as capable as warriors, or not thought to be, However, this dude absolutely just completely turned a 180, flipped the fucking table over, and made the warriors their bitches so bad that for the rest of Dragonspyre's history, the warriors would never have the political momentum to ever attempt anything like this again. It's pretty fucking crazy. Interestingly, though, the warrior's supposed needs for the knowledge of the wizard's spells would actually be a pretty valid reason later on, considering the fact that Boris Blackrock, the obsidian golem, was actually trained by the council to defend the wizard's knowledge from the warriors, but when the wizard summoned the Titan, only Boris Blackrock was said to have known how to defeat the Titan, but at the end of the day, he just wasn't capable of doing it himself. So when getting into more modern bits of Dragonspyre history, like modern day Dragonspyre history where everything's destroyed and the events that led up to that, there seems to be a pretty big gap between the formation of the Council of Wizards, Warriors, and Kings, and then literally anything else important happening up until the destruction of Dragonspyre with the summoning of the Dragon Titan. So, first, I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the culture of Dragonspyre and what I've been able to ascertain through not necessarily direct statements that conclusively say this or that, but rather some things that you can just kind of tell from looking at and experiencing some of the stuff you might see in the background, and just stuff that kind of goes under the radar when just simply reading dialogue, right? So next up would be the topic of the Dragon Riders, and sadly there's not a whole lot of information when talking about the Dragon Riders just in general. It's never really particularly stated what the importance of the Dragon Riders were, other than it could basically be seen as a symbolic merging of the Drake and humans that would go on to create Dragonspyre. But aside from that, like, the only thing that we know is that there are a couple legendary Dragon Riders throughout history, like Tomar Skyblade and Kimmereth Windhammer, but none of their quests really seem to further too much more information on the Dragon Riders. However, it does go into detail and talk about, I guess, Drake and mankind etiquette towards each other. Like, in the story, it talks about, a Dragon Rider needs to bond with a Drake at an early age, and from there, they're going to be best buddies for life, so they need to come to terms and respect each other. Dragon Riders need to remember that, regardless of who wields, the power in the relationship, who's more dominant, at the end of the day, the Drake's the one that gives the Dragon Rider their ability to be a Dragon Rider, whatnot, and yeah, stuff like that. I want to say the only other thing I can think about when it comes to Dragon Riders is the fact that a Dragon Rider staff is somehow required in the process of riding a Drake. I'm not sure if it's like physically required by the laws of nature that have not been explained to us, or if that was just some bullshit formality to kind of add some level of lore that ended up falling flat and being vague and not really meaning anything. But yeah, and a Dragon Rider staff is just a flawless crystal attached to the head of a staff to then become a Dragon Rider staff. And apparently you can't just make one on your own. You got to go travel a fucking spiral to find 4 different pieces of a staff that was broken and spread around the spiral a long time ago for unknown reasons. It's dumb, but yeah, that's basically it. Also, interestingly enough, it's stated directly by our Drake, the one that we raise and use to reach Malastare, that Drakes cannot leave Dragonspyre. However, apparently that's no longer the case. It's been completely retconned by the Catacombs lore, because Prince Vigor took his Drake from Dragonspyre to the Catacombs, and we fight either a Knowledge Crystal version or the soul of Prince Vigor's Drake. But chances are he definitely brought it with him somehow. So yeah, Kingsisle is like very confused on what a Drake should be capable of. So I know I had mentioned that knowledge would be granted to everybody so that they could learn how to best use it and wield it after the events of Rydal's Plague and whatnot. Dragonspyre would actually start to use knowledge crystals to store lessons in them, kind of like how to train your dragon and stuff like that. as well as store the souls of their greatest heroes and foes. During our time playing throughout the Crucible and other different parts, you can actually find different souls of heroes long since passed from Dragonspyre's history who tell you a little bit about some of the pre-Dragonspyre Academy history and whatnot, and events that happened shortly after the founding of Dragonspyre Academy. But for the most part, I'm not going to go too far into it just because it doesn't really add anything that I haven't already brought up. Throughout questing in Dragonspyre, we find out that later Dragonspyre instructors would find their students not really appreciating the value of magical combat in Drake writing, and would actually tell us multiple times that, hey, Dragonspyre would have been saved if there were students like you who were so eager and willing to learn before the inevitable destruction of Dragonspyre. And the reason for that seems to be that in later years, Dragonspyre Academy seems to have become a place for political advancement, whether that be in the army or in some sort of social status, I would imagine. And Dragonspyre Academy would also just straight up indoctrinate its students into the army to become battle mages and warriors for their army. I'm not sure who the fuck they were fighting before the Dragon Titans army, but I mean, it was relatively successful. For the most part, they seemed to be able to prosper for fair amounts of time, disregarding their own personal wars and, plagues and whatnot. And a lot of this is actually due to the fact that Dragonspyre's defenses were basically created by a guy who was super smart in creating a relatively impenetrable system. This guy is known as Auric Blazeburner, who created the Portal Stone system to keep enemies outside of the city, outside the city walls. For the most part, that seemed to work. Up until, some asshole summoned the Dragon Titan inside the city, but I'll get into that in a minute. It would seem that almost everybody in Dragonspyre would actually have access to the outermost rings, and the outermost ring would have places like, it looks like mostly residential, forums, and library, stuff like that. And oddly enough, the outermost ring actually has access to Dragonspyre's vaults, where they kept things from like their country's treasure, all the way up to things like doomsday machines that you can find in a side quest that need to be locked behind multiple different security measures to keep from being left out for, the wrong people to find. That shit is straight up in the game, and it was in there in the vanilla storyline. Interestingly enough, around the time that the Dragon Titan actually started destroying or raging through Dragonspyre with his armies, the vaults were so reliable that a lone Dragonspyre soldier by the name of Vasek Ashweaver, with the help of a beautiful or handsome main character such as ourselves, would actually look to save Dragonspyre's treasury by locking all of the vaults, and he himself would selflessly sacrifice himself to halt the Dragon Titan's advances by locking himself away inside of one of the vaults with one of the only available portal stones that could actually grant access to the third ring, where Dragonspyre Academy was located. So just a second ago, I had mentioned the fact that Dragonspyre was protected by a ring wall system that was further defended by a portal stone system around it, or inside of it, that basically kept enemies out. And for the majority of Dragonspyre history, it would seem that this would defend Dragonspyre very well. Pretty much anytime there's a big issue in Dragonspyre, it seems to only have come from people inside Dragonspyre doing stuff and causing incidents like usurping the throne or accidentally unleashing a plague. And that would continue to be the case, and the exact reason why Dragonspyre fell to ruin and was just utterly destroyed. The Dean of Admissions in Dragonspyre Academy was apparently the ringleader in this mysterious dragon cult that all we know is it said that they were just a sect of evil dark mages that just didn't want anything in specific. I don't know how better to word that, because Kingsisle never actually wrote into the game, wrote into any of the lore, responded to any of my fucking tweets about why the dragon cult summoned the Dragon Titan. Now, it's very obvious that there were some political shenanigans going on between wizards and warriors. However, no matter what I have looked through as far as quest dialogue, side quest dialogue, I tweeted Kingsisle to see if they would bother answering that question, and they never did, as far as I know. There's not a single reason for why the Dragon Cult specifically chose to summon the Dragon Titan inside the city, other than it maybe being a move to garner support and political power, as well as potential military power. But even then, that's just theory and conjecture. There's nothing stating the reason why they summoned it inside the city. But apparently, the Dean of Admissions, Vladimir Darkflame, was sort of the ringleader in that whole shabacle. I personally couldn't find this, but I was told by somebody else in Wiz that the Dean wasn't particularly happy with the overall status of Dragonspyre, or sort of the social flow, I guess you could say, the way things were going. I don't know what specifically caused him to be upset about that, but he was upset and just decided to summon the Dragon Titan. The way he did it was actually pretty fucked up, if I do say so. Apparently, he kidnapped a bunch of professors, and with the help of his Dragon Cult allies, just straight up started to summon the Dragon Titan in the middle of Dragonspyre, leaving all of its citizens to face the Dragon Titan, as well as the onslaught of Dragon Titan soldiers and battle mages. Like, it must have been fucking terrifying. Like, imagine being in the middle of New York City during the Avengers movie, like whenever Thanos' army is coming down and fucking people up. Like, that is probably how things went down, except Dragonspyre didn't have the Avengers or us, the main character. And, you know, things played out accordingly. Dragonspyre fell. I want to say one of the only noteworthy things that I can remember is obviously that thing I said about Vasek Ashweaver, you know, sealing himself in a vault to protect Dragonspyre's treasures and to try and halt the advance of the Dragon Titan. I know that Boris Blackrock was created by the Council of Wizards in order to protect the wizards from the warriors. However, when some of the wizards summon the Dragon Titan, it's implied that like all of the wizards did it, but then sometimes other wizards will condemn certain, like, the Dragon Cult for doing it. So I'm not really sure who's responsible specifically or how many of them, but it's specifically stated in the dialogue that Boris Blackrock was the only one with the knowledge who would have been able to defeat the Dragon Titan if he were capable of it, you know, power-wise, but that wasn't the case, and he basically got beaten to shit and his body was destroyed. It's a miracle we managed to salvage his soul into a knowledge crystal. From that point on, there's not a whole lot to talk about. Nothing that I could really remember that was super, super important to the Dragonspyre lore. After the fall of Dragonspyre, however, apparently, like, obviously the whole place was left in ruins, everything was burnt to shit and destroyed. The ecosystem of Dragonspyre actually completely changed. In the time dungeon we go through, we actually get to see what it was like before, or a little bit what it was like before, and it's not too far off from looking kind of like Ravenwood or Triton Avenue with the trees and the blue skies and the running water. However, the landscape completely changed after the Dragon Titan destroyed the world, burning it all, making, glassing everything, turning everything into obsidian and ash and lava. And remember when I was talking about the catacombs and that one Dragonspyre soldier who was following Vigor, Rogar Webfist? I think Kingsisle was trying to hint at the fact that when Rogar Webfist brought a spider and introduced it into the ecosystem of Dragonspyre, apparently that spun off into its own web of issues. Pun intended. I made that up on the spot. I'm not even joking. I wasn't even thinking about that. But apparently that caused this whole deal with spiders invading all throughout Dragonspyre, but mainly being centered around the Crystal Grove, which kind of ties into why there are so many spiders in the Crystal Grove and why there are multiple different side quests in the Crystal Grove where we have to defeat a lot of spiders and basically exterminate them to the point where we're able to control their numbers so that they're not wreaking havoc everywhere. So that'll pretty much do it for the Dragonspyre history video. I know one of my commenters, Sydney P, wanted to know a little bit more about the actual story of Dragonspyre as, you know, we the player character are going through it. And I'd like to include it in here, but right now the video is just a bit too long, so I'm probably actually going to make a world review episode, I guess. That's something I could do in the future, where I just kind of talk about, you know, in a nutshell, what we do throughout the worlds. We'll call it worlds in a nutshell or something like that. But don't worry, I'll get to that. That might be like the next project I do while I figure out, you know, who the next character profile is going to be on. But anyway, hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one, I guess.
No, I keep fizzling.